All right. Well, I'm going to read a little bit. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 8, and I'm going to read some of it because there's a lot I want to say. So we did this in Bible study, so I pretty liked it pretty much. And I was like, man, I think I'm going to teach it again. And there's some things that I couldn't say. There's a lot of things I had a short span of time. So there's a few little things I would like to tell y'all about that I find was pretty interesting. So if y'all there, Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 8. Now I want to kind of give y'all a little brief of what's going on here. And before this, in chapter 7, David, when he's rested, his enemies, he has peace with his enemies about that time. And so he has an idea. And he's like, I want to build a temple for God. Because back then, the religious centers, like the kingdoms back then, their capital was not only a political entity, but it was also a religious center. The separation of church and state didn't have that much back then. Pretty much they came together. In some cases, they still do. Like in the Muslim countries and a few other places, religion and state still combines. So back then, that's how it was 90% of the time. So David's like, other kingdoms have temples, to their false gods. And, of course, we have the true living God. We have, the real God. So why not we can honor him and build him a temple? If these pagans can honor their gods, why we can't honor our God with a temple, a place of worship? So, and the prophet says, hey, do whatever it seems in your heart. But God stops the prophet Nathan. He says, David, don't tell David not to build a temple because he's a man of war. He's a man of ambition. He's a man of blood. I want this temple, if it's going to be dedicated to me, I want this temple to be built with no blood. I want to be built on peace. And so God told David, you won't build it, but your generation will build it. Your ancestors or your sons and your family after you will build this temple. So I want to keep that in mind because as we go a little bit through the story, that will pop up one way or another. So y'all keep that in mind. But anyway, God tells him that, and he's like, well, I got to do what God tells me to do. But now in chapter 8, he's about to get into some war. So we're going to read a little bit about it. I ain't going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to tell you about it as we go along. Okay, it says, verse 8. After this, it came to pass that David attacked the Philistines and subdued them and took Mega Ammon from the hands of the Philistines. That was actually another name for the city of Gath, a Philistine city. Then he defeated Moab, forcing them down to the ground, and he measured them off with a line. With 2 lines, he measured off those to put to death, and 1 full line, those he kept alive. So the Moabites became David's servants and brought tribute. David also defeated Hazar, the son of Adon, king of Zoras. He went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates. So we got to keep that in mind, the river Euphrates right there. And David took from him 1,000 chariots, 700,000 horsemen, and 7,000 foot soldiers. Also David absorbed all the chariots and horses, that except he spared enough of them for 100 chariots. Now, there's more to cover, but we're going to cover it as we go along. Now, in this chapter, in chapter 8, I could see the plot of it pretty much. There's other details here and there, but the plot of this chapter really is that David is actually fulfilling a prophecy, or part of it anyway. Matter of fact, I have it. In Genesis, if y'all ever want to look it up, God promises Abraham the land boundaries. If you look up Genesis chapter 15, verses 8 and 21, God told Abraham when he was looking at the north sky, back then he was a nomad. They would live in tents, so he would go out there and, walk in the coolness of the day in the Middle East. It gets cool at night. So he's walking out his tent. And the Lord starts talking to Abraham, and he looks up in the sky, and God tells him, can you number the stars? And he says, well, that's how your descendants will be. They will be numerous like the stars of heaven. And then God gives him a boundary. God tells him how much land his ancestors will actually take. he actually gives them the border. He says, where modern Israel's at today, he said, you will have all that. You will have all Lebanon, half of Syria, and according to all the way to the Euphrates River, matter of fact, modern-day Iraq in the future will actually be the Holy Land. That's the boundary. It would end right there. But that will happen in the near future. In the millennial kingdom, when Christ comes back after Armageddon, when he defeats the Antichrist and the false prophet, that's when God is going to, when the Jews are going to accept Jesus as their true Messiah, that's when the Abrahamic covenant will be completed. That's where they'll have all their borders that God promised them at that time. But that's for future. But at this time, David and Solomon, it was actually Israel's golden age. This is where half, not all of it, of course, but this is where some of the promises that God made to Abraham actually came true during the time of David and King Solomon's reign. So I find it's pretty interesting how God kept his word, and God will complete his word in the end of days. So that all that land God will give to the children of Israel when the time is right. So matter of fact, the land Israel got, that's not all the land that God promised them. That's UN type land mass, I'll be honest with you. The world gave her that, in a boundary area. But God really expanded Israel to have a lot more territory than what she got right now. And they're fighting, and then the world's fighting to let her keep with the little bit she got. It's a size maybe of New Jersey right now, the land of Israel. So God promised a lot more to them, and God will fulfill his promise. And then another thing I want to talk about right here, about the Philistines. Now, who were these Philistines? Because if you read in the book of Samuel, they're one of Israel's greatest enemies. They pop up from the book of Judges. Even in Exodus, they pop up. Matter of fact, Moses wanted to go a different route, and God told him not to go that route because it was the way of the Philistines, because if Israel would face war, they would change their mind. So other than that, you see that these enemies of Israel, they pop up a lot. Who were these Philistines? And to be honest, it's a mystery. There was a thing called the Sea Peoples back in the day. They were kind of like the Vikings, kind of. You ever heard about the Vikings, how the Vikings went ships and they just started raiding everywhere? But this kind of happened to the Sea Peoples in the Middle East. There was some disaster. Nobody knows. It's something that went on at that time. It was the Bronze Age. It was at the Dark Age of the Middle East. And they started pirating, or they started looking for land, or they started just going plunder everywhere. And one of these groups of Sea Peoples were the Philistines. They were actually captured by the Egyptians. They were trying to conquer Egypt. And Pharaoh, I think it was Ramses the first or second, he actually caught them. And he's like, I'm going to make them my soldiers. So he placed them in the Gaza area. So that's where some people believe where the Philistines maybe came from. But they were Israel's big enemies. They were actually Israel's thorn in their side. And what was amazing about them, they had a weapon advantage. They had I think it was bronze. And the other enemies had some type of other weapon that they didn't have. So they were one of the dominant people in the area. But David actually defeats them right here. And they come part of his extra army, I guess you can say. If he needs extra military force, he can call upon the Philistines, and they will bring him military support. And one of the biggest weapons that the Philistines had, and that's what David wanted, was the chariot. They had a certain chariot where they had 2 riders and 2 horsemen, and there was an extra bowman on there. And they said they went about 70 miles an hour, but they were good. They were bowmen. They were actually good archmen. So David wanted these and to help him in his wars because of their chariot export. So David did the first thing first. He says, I'm going to defeat the Philistines before I move any further. I'm going to deal with the enemies at home. Because the Philistines were just right there. So he says, I'm going to deal with the Philistines first before I move on. So I believe David's opportunity now. He said, I'm going to go fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham. I believe, I could be wrong, but I think he had that vision that God promised Abraham all this land, and I'm determined to maybe go out there and conquer the land that God promised our great-great-great-grandfather Abraham. So this is what chapter 8 is really all about mostly. He's about to go and conquer the land. Well, he don't do all of it, but he's going to determine, hey, I'm going to conquer some of this land that God promised Abraham. And then he goes to defeat Moab. Now, this is very interesting because Moab, David's great-great-grandmother came from Moab. You remember Ruth? Yeah, she actually comes from Moab. So he's attacking actually his great-grandmother's homeland. And a lot of people's like, well, why he would do that? Well, you got to understand, that was one of Israel's biggest enemies as well at this particular point. I mean, they're attacking Israel, they're raiding, so there's a lot of things going on. So he had to put them as, he attacks them so they won't be a threat to him and his kingdom. And the Bible says he puts them as tribute. Now, back in the day, two things you could have done when you conquered people back in those days. One, you could have actually took over their kingdom. You could destroy their government. You could have totally absorbed the kingdom, I guess you could say, or annex the kingdom. And you could have totally took it over. You could have put a governor, and you pretty much, it became part of your nation. Or two, you could have went and you could have made them tributaries or vassal states, they call them. Well, in other words, it's kind of like a mafia type. Y'all know what mafia, you ever heard about the mafia and stuff? Well, it was kind of like a mafia racket. Back in the day, they went to a store and they're like, hey, you got to pay protection money, because there's other guys out there, other gang people or other people, they can come and bust up your store. So if you pay us, we make sure that they don't come bust up your store. So that's kind of similar what happened to these vassal states or tributary states. They weren't part of the kingdom, but to keep the other kingdom at bay, to totally occupying your kingdom, they're like, hey, we'll pay you protection money. We'll pay you money to keep you out of our country. You took over us in a way, but we don't want to be part of your kingdom. We don't want to be part of, your system. So we pay you money, to kind of keep you at bay, So they pay for protection or for autonomy. In other words, to keep their country for, independence pretty much. So that's what David did. David made the Moabites his tributaries, and he's going to do that with other kingdoms as well. And we talked about the Euphrates. We talked about how God promised, the Euphrates River. We discussed that already. Now, another thing I want to talk about is that God told David, because remember we talked about the temple? Well, God told David, you cannot build a temple because you're a man of war and stuff like that. Well, God never told him that he couldn't get materials ready for the temple. So when David, if you ever get a chance to read all of this, when he plunders his kingdoms, he takes silver and he takes gold, he takes bronze, and in the scripture says he dedicated them to God. In other words, what he did was, he's like, I'm getting the temple ready. Other words, I'm getting things ready. So I can't do it. God told me I can't build this temple, but he did not tell me I cannot make a way for the temple or prepare materials for the temple. So when he's conquering these lands, that's what he's doing. He's taking all these tributaries, he's taking their money, he's taking the spoils from war, and he's piling it up. He's actually getting ready for the temple. Matter of fact, when Solomon came, all Solomon had to do really was hire the people. That's all he had to really do, really. He just had to get a few things ready here and there, but everything was there. David and all his people actually prepared the way for Solomon. They had if I heard it right, they even had the building, what's that word I want to say? Yeah, blueprint. They already had the blueprint. They already had the gold there. So everything was ready for Solomon. A lot of people don't realize that. Some people think when Solomon came to power, he had to get everything ready, but not really. David prepared everything. And the Bible says, was it in Deuteronomy, or I'm trying to remember where it was, but it says that a good father leaves a good inheritance for his children. So pretty much David is leaving inheritance. David is leaving materials for Solomon. I was hearing a minister say this, and he's right, and that can apply to a lot of people. So you see, a lot of times, a lot of us, we have dreams and we have visions, and we're like David, we have a desire to do things, but it's not our time. It's not for us to do it. Maybe somebody else will come. Maybe God will open the door and God will use somebody else to fulfill your dream. I was watching a documentary. a lot of people realize, well, Abraham Lincoln, he freed the slaves and stuff. But what most people don't realize, there was men before him that trained Abraham Lincoln, that advised Abraham Lincoln. Like, for example, there was a guy, was it Thomas Madison, one of those guys? He actually told Abraham Lincoln about slavery. He told him how bad it was. So in other words, he didn't fulfill his dream. He didn't end slavery. But God used another man, Abraham Lincoln. So God used that man to prepare Abraham Lincoln for the big task. So I hope I'm making myself clear that that's what happened with David. David had a dream, David had a vision, but he couldn't fulfill his dream and vision. So God was going to use somebody else. So sometimes, you might be a seed planter. You might be laying a foundation, and then maybe God will use somebody else to build on that foundation. So sometimes, that's that. So don't get discouraged. Like in the Reformation, for example, before Martin Luther did what he did, there was other men who prepared the way for him. There was Huss and John Wycliffe and other Christians before him that actually prepared the way for Martin Luther. So, and God used that man, even I don't agree with everything he did, but God used him to bring all Europe to biblical Christianity in some form and a way. So sometimes don't get discouraged when like, well, I can't fulfill all my dreams, or it's not all coming true yet. Well, maybe it might happen in your lifetime. Maybe God might open a door that you will maybe do your dreams. But maybe God's like, you're just a seed planter. You're just a foundational person. And somebody else will come and finish the job for you. So that's what pretty much happened right there with King David and King Solomon. So sometimes when you hear things like that, that encourages you sometimes to know that, it might not happen in my lifetime, but maybe my dream will come true one way or another. So don't ever get discouraged when you feel like, hey, I never reached my tool potential, my tool of goal, and stuff like that. Now, another thing I want to talk about too that I think is fascinating, that if you will read these chapters later on, God told them not to multiply wives and horses. Matter of fact, it's in Deuteronomy when God lays all the rules down for the kings. God gave them because God knew ahead of time. God knew in his divine wisdom, in the future, that Israel would want a king. So God told Moses to write in the book of Deuteronomy what a king should do and what a king should not do. See, a king had to follow the rules just like the rest of the Jews had to follow the law. So more probably than the king. The king probably, because he was a ruler, he probably had more rules to follow than probably his Jewish subjects. But God gave a list. And one of the lists that's pretty amazing, he says, don't multiply yourselves wives, and don't multiply yourselves horses. And I'm going to explain why. First, God says, don't multiply, if you have kings, don't multiply yourselves wives. Why God did that? That too. Yeah, you're right, Mom. Well, one man and one woman is good enough to handle, so, that's another thing too. So God was wise. God's like, you marry one person, that's good enough. They're a headache already. You got enough to deal with. So that's another thing too. But anyway, but another reason why I feel, because God's design in the Garden of Eden also was one man, one woman. So that was always God's design. Men messed it up. Culture messed it up, mostly back in those days when they married a bunch of women and whatever. But God's design was one man and one woman for life. So that's another thing too. And another thing too, back then, kings would marry, they would marry queens from other kingdoms to build an alliance. For example, if you married a king from Egypt, if you're a Syrian king and you married an Egyptian queen, your son, you became the son-in-law of that king, and he's not going to fight his own son-in-law. So that was a political alliance. And so back then, that's what they did. And matter of fact, and then God didn't want Israel to go to idolatry. Because that's what happened. That's what happened with King Solomon. And when we ever get to it, King Solomon did alliance with these kings, and he ended up backsliding and worshiping false gods, and that started a whole trouble right there. So I think that's one of the reasons why, in my humble opinion, why God didn't want these kings to multiply themselves. He didn't want them to marry foreign women that would bring idolatry to the land and to themselves. So, and chariots and horsemen. Why God told them not to multiply yourselves, chariots and horses? Well, One reason why God did that, God didn't want them to have faith in their military. Because you see, God wanted them to have faith in him. You know, because it's easily, as human beings, it's easily, to be honest, no matter if you're Christian or even if you're non-Christian, you start to have faith in yourself. Like, for example, if you have a good job, there's nothing wrong having a good job or having a good life, but sometimes when you start to have faith in what you can do. You start like, hey, man, I got security, I got a lot of money, a good job. And a lot of times we forget God a lot of times. And we do. A lot of times we get so comfortable and we're like, I don't need God. I got my money. I only pray to God when I'm broke in the bank. Let's be honest. Some people think like that. Or I only want God when things are bad in my life. When things are really, really bad, then I go to church. So God's like, I don't want you to have faith in those things. I want you to have faith in me. And, because back then the chariot was like the modern day tank. I mean, if you had a chariot, and you had a good bit of them, there's a strong possibility you can dominate a lot of kingdoms, and you can have a strong. You've been in superpower of its day if you had some good chariots, but God said, I want you to have faith in me. Like in the book of Judges, Gideon, for example. Why people say, why God made Gideon have a few soldiers? Because Israel was bragging. Israel was getting to the point where like, hey, it's because of our numbers. It's because how strong we are. And so God limited, his army to show them, because if men would looked at it, they were like, there's no way this little army could beat this huge army. There's no way in the world they could. So God did that impossible situation to show them that it had to be God that did it, if that makes any sense. And so God didn't want Israel to have faith in their strength. He didn't want to have faith in their numbers. Matter of fact, I think it's in Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, I believe. No, 1st Chronicles, my bad. When David said, I want to number my people. I want to number my army to see how big my army is. And Joab made his general had some... Joab had some problems, but this is where Joab had wisdom. He said, David, it's God that gave us the victory when we fought all these enemies. It's not in our army. It's not how big our army is. But that's one time David did not listen. And David's like, well, I want to number my people. I want to know how strong I am. I want to know how my army is strong and powerful. And because he put his faith in his army, he put his faith in the numbers, that actually sent a plague. God gave him 2 choices. God said, you can have a plague or your enemies can take over you. And he chose the plague because he said, God is merciful than men. So he ended up killed a good bit of people. The number that he chose, or the number he had faith in, all died pretty much. So God didn't want Israel to put their faith in their army. Like America, for example. I love my country. I'm the most patriotic person you can find, and Daddy can tell you. I'm patriotic. If the Russians will invade tomorrow, I'll be the first one to be a mini-man. I'll grab my gun, okay? But the thing is, though, as Americans, though, we think we're invincible. We think, well, we have an army. We have a powerful army. Nobody can touch us. We do have that mentality. And I think when September 11 happened, that kind of made people open their eyes a little bit to realize, we could be attacked. We're not as invincible as we thought we were. So a lot of times, even as Americans, we put our faith in our military, that we the big and bad dogs of the world and nobody can touch us. And we put our faith in our military. We put our faith in our economy. And a lot of times as Americans, we do like Israel. We forget God and realize God is our strength. God is our military. God is our general. He's our weapon, not the weapons that we have. So that's why God didn't want them to multiply horses unto themselves. God didn't want them to brag and say it was our chariots, it was our generals that did this. Yeah, it's our own strength, our own power that did this. God wanted to show Israel and the world that, hey, it had to be God's divine providence to win these wars and stuff like that. So I encourage you today, I hope this was actually an encouragement to you, that to let you know that God's promises are always there. Even if you can't fulfill them, God's promise, God can do it to someone else. He can do it to your children. He can do it to your grandchildren. He can fulfill your dreams through somebody else as well. So don't ever get discouraged. Like me, for example, like uh, I have a lot of dreams. I ain't gonna lie to you. I have a lot of dreams. I have a lot of dreams, but poor man. I got a lot of ambitions, but poor man. It's kind of, I'm limited. Most of these days. So I got a lot of dreams, and one of my dreams is, to be honest, like I wrote some books, and my dream is like I would love to see a movie of it. And I'll be like, man, if I only had the money, only if I knew the connections, and God told me the other day when I heard that sermon. And when I heard that preacher say that, God told me, well, Boog, maybe you're laying the groundwork. Maybe a she or he will come and do that part. So sometimes, and I was like, wow, it could happen that way, that God can use somebody else to fill the rest of my dream. So, so don't get discouraged, when you have a dream, just keep praying, about that. So